There's going to be a bit of pace in this session, so please do shout out if the pace is becoming unmanageable. I'm going to do my best to deliver you at least the thrust of the general messages, and to hopefully also open up the space for a bit of conversation. That might have been my mistake last time around. I think it was valuable, but obviously I need to find the right balance. So let's go to the next slide, please, Sam. This is what I'm hoping to do today, is to offer you some insights from the work of the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education in its full name, and I'm going to try and refer to it as EASNI, which is a formal abbreviation. And I'm going to try and relate these to two facets of our work in the English context, one around teacher training and professional development, and the second around the role of special schools in the wider education ecosystem. And time allowing, I'll also show you one particular example of really realigning and re-articulating the role of some special schools in order to have a more constructive role in the schooling and the wider school system. And then in the slides which we will share after the talk, you will also see a number of links, and I will encourage you to have a look at these and use the resources. I'll say as a general note, EASNI has a really accessible and helpful website. In it, there's quite a lot of research, there's policy, documentation, and a good number of different toolkits on different areas, which are useful for really, I would say, anyone from classroom teachers to policy leaders at national and local government. So just a quick word to encourage you to have a look. Again, the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education, if you Google that or search it in another search engine, it will come up quite easily. Next slide, please, Sam. I'm going to speed through these because I don't want to waste too much of our time. The agency was founded back in 1996, and it is all about collaboration with education ministries across Europe. Members of the agency are from across the EU, but also outside of it, including Iceland, Norway, and of course the UK as well. Post-Brexit, still remained a member of the agency. And I was just reflecting in the previous session, actually in the intervening time between preparing this presentation and today, there's another country member in North Macedonia who literally joined at the beginning of November. Next slide, please, Sam. And as you would expect, the purpose of the agency is to support development of inclusive education systems across Europe, and to ensure that there are equitable education opportunities for all learners, and enhancing their life chances and societal participation. And they do this by collaboration with ministries of education in member countries, and also fostering collaborations between different member countries and the ministries, providing evidence-based guidance, and they have a focus on integrating policy, practice, and research perspectives. Next slide, please. Right. Now, I just want to set out in as clear terms as I can what EASNI mean when they talk about inclusion. And I was saying in the previous session that this is important, especially in light of the fact that in the English context, we haven't actually gotten round to articulate an agreed upon definition, notwithstanding the fact that Ofsted has gone some way towards doing so. So the two facets of the definition of inclusion I would like to touch upon. One is, if I put it very simply, a strict adherence to the social model of disability and SEN, and following the Salamanca Statement and the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled Persons and Article 24. In other words, moving away from construing disability and SEN as focusing on individual categories of need, towards enhancing the universal provision and attending to barriers. So if you think about in the English context, possibly the Equality Act is a good way to conceptualize it. If you think about the anticipatory duty for reasonable adjustments, that is the kind of thing that the agency speaks about. And to also acknowledge that really inclusive education is a political aspiration, and it moves beyond simply placing as many pupils as possible in mainstream towards thinking more widely about removing barriers from the environment. Again, very much in line with the social model of disability. The second aspect, if you go to the next slide, please, Sam, of the conceptualization of inclusion, which I think is important to share, is that EASNI, and I would say more widely in Europe, certainly more than is the case at the moment, they really take the view of inclusion encompassing way beyond only SEND. So think about things like all other marginalized communities in the continent. For instance, there's quite a lot of emphasis at the moment around marginalized Roma communities, what we in England probably call the travelers, talking about people living in conditions of rurality, of poverty, pupils who might have in the household parents who are incarcerated, medical conditions, etc., etc. So really, really widening that prism of what we're talking about when we talk about inclusion. And I suppose in the English context, you might think about what academics would call intersectionality, so understanding disadvantage in a more nuanced way. So that was a really quick survey to try and explain what the European Agency is, what they aim to do, and what they are talking about when they talk about inclusion. If you go to the next slide, please. So just a bit of technical detail to put things in context. The agency staff include the secretariat, the leadership, and a group of researchers. Each member country is represented by a representative board member who is from the Ministry of Education, in our case from the Department for Education, and a national coordinator, which can be either from the ministry or from an arm's length agency. In our case, it is the latter. The Council for Disabled Children is commissioned by DFE to hold the national coordinator post, and the national coordinator himself is yours truly, and that is part of the Contract Court Strategic Reform Partnership. The bottom line for the purposes of today, I suppose, is that I do have the privilege of representing England in this agency and to be plugged into much of the activities they carry out. And I also should say openly that part of my brief as national coordinator is to help EASNI disseminate the materials. And this is one of the reasons I'm encouraging you to have a look at the website and to make use of the resources. Of course, the other more important reason I'm doing so is because I genuinely think they are helpful. They are free to access. And I think they are pushing in the right kind of direction in respect of the ethos and approach to education. Next slide, please, Sam. Right, so as I said, I'm going to try and speak to two particular projects, which speak to the first one about professional development and training of the teaching workforce, and the second around the role of special schools. If you do go to the EASNI website, you will open it and you'll see a tab at the top saying activities. Activities is the term they use for what we would probably call projects. And that's where you will find these two projects, but also many others as well, which you might find interesting depending on where you're coming from professionally. And of course, I don't have that information at my hands at the moment. So the TPL project, the Teacher Professional Learning for Inclusion, ran between 2018 and 2022. And it took a comprehensive look at what approaches are best suitable to preparing all teachers to support all learners in inclusive education settings. And the outcomes were really with an aim to inspire a wider range of teaching professional learning opportunities for inclusion and to address all education professionals involved, including teachers in different stages of their career and other support staff and wider school staff as well. One of the outputs of this particular project was a self-audit tool for policy makers and education leadership to reflect on if and to what extent they'd created an architecture, a system to support sufficient and high quality enough learning for teachers around the specific issue of inclusion. And one key point for me on this, bearing in mind I don't have time to go into the detail of this, and if you're interested, you will go and have to do some exploration by yourselves. If you do that, you will notice that the focus of this project and its outputs were not on the specific body of knowledge around understanding particular impairments, for instance. So this is not about training teachers up in understanding neurodiversity or how best to work with, PMLD. It's more about that foundational knowledge, which is value-based, on what does it mean and what does it take to be an inclusive educational practitioner. And the next slide hopefully will make that point a bit clearer, because I'm going to go over the values they set out. And again, just to say, in this particular project, and it's also the case in pretty much everything else that the EASNI does, a wide range of stakeholders took part in shaping the project. So what you're seeing over here, one might feel a bit obvious, has been put together with the voices of children and young people, very importantly, parent carers, and a wide variety of professionals, up to the level of kind of policymakers, both in national and in local government. So value learning diversity, and I'll just make the point over here relatively briefly, and if anybody wants to speak about this a bit more at the end, you're more than welcome to. I think there's two parts to this. One is the slightly obvious one around having an ethos of being welcoming to all, regardless of background and ability, etc. The other bit, which is more to do with direct practice, is understanding that diversity quite in practical terms and genuinely can be an asset to enrich the learning environment. So if you think, for instance, I'll just give two quick examples on this. If you think, for instance, about those learners who might struggle with the modes of communication most commonly used in the classroom, so spoken and unwritten communication, they very often bring with them the ability to communicate in alternative methods. If you think, for instance, on about the use of Makaton. For me, if the whole class is taught at least the basics of Makaton, you've really enriched the communication abilities, the learning experience, and offer them a whole new range of communication, which really can come in handy later in their life. And equally, if you think about the creativity, what in layman's terms is quite often referred to as kind of thinking outside of the box, that comes with sometimes cases of neurodiversity. These are things that can, of course, be really helpful in a classroom environment. And I think another fringe benefit, of course, is if you take this kind of positive approach to try and tease out the individual special talents and abilities that a wide variety of learners will have in a classroom, you're also more likely to be able to minimize the occurrence or the common occurrences of behaviors that challenge. I've said quite a lot in the last 2 minutes on the understanding that many of you will be education or health professionals, and that would make sense. But as I said, if you want to interrogate me or dispute that at the end of the session, I'm more than happy to have a conversation. Supporting all learners, I'm not going to dwell on this point. It really just to signpost back to what I said earlier around how EASNI construes inclusion. In this case, understanding we're not only talking about those who have been identified as having SEND, we're also talking about people who might be marginalized for all host of reasons. And of course, also understanding something which I think by now is also well articulated in the English system, that children and young people will move in and out of SEND status according to their context and circumstance. So this really is just to make the point that we need to look at the whole host of people who turn up in a classroom and make sure that what we do in that classroom setting is suitable for them to engage meaningfully. Working with others, over here I would say in the context of the English system, a lot of this is actually around working with, for instance, allied health professionals. Do teachers understand how to access, for instance, a pediatric OT? Do professionals understand, are they aware of the pathways to speech and language in the local area? You will know, some of you better than me, that really varies in how it looks across the country. Another point of this, which is more prominent on the continent, and it might become a bit more of a feature in England, dependent on the white paper direction, is co-teaching. A response or a route to inclusive practice in the continent quite often is to have a specialist teacher teach side by side what we would call over here a mainstream teacher as a kind of a long-term strategy. And of course that requires to do it properly and effectively, that requires quite a bit of preparation and prior understanding of the system and how the pedagogy around it might work. And then lastly, personal and joint professional development, and that's been widely acknowledged, and I think also a gap that needs to be attended to in the English context. How are we training teachers to begin with? Excuse me. I know that in the plenary session this morning, there was already some talk about the fact that really the SEND content in our initial teacher training, for instance, is, I would say, pretty pitiful. So that needs to be attended to. But of course, teacher training is only the beginning of the journey. If we expect teachers to spend their life teaching, we would want to see ongoing development, which is well coordinated, which has a clear thread through it. It's sequenced in a rational way, and of course, you would like inclusion within that to be a constant thread within it, and also acknowledging that our knowledge around SEND and inclusion develops constantly. So, if you've done training on understanding autism 15 years ago, you are out of date by now. Certainly, if you think about things like understanding autism in girls, just by way of one handy example. Next slide, please, Sam. Right, and quite helpfully, some of the recommendations from the TPL project were divided into sort of the spheres of influence. And again, I'm going to allow you a moment to read them while I rest my voice, but I just want to highlight one point from each of the levels. So at the national regional level, and again, we're talking really about the teaching workforce over here as opposed to all of the system, attending to the gaps between different stages of education in a professional's career. So again, think about the difference between a newly qualified teacher, for instance, and an experienced teacher, which by now also has extra responsibilities such as a head of department. How do we ensure there's continuity and rationale between the different bits of professional development happening there? At the community level, making sure that we foster collaboration between schools, the teacher education institutions, and support services and local authorities around it. And again, I know that I'm pretty certain there's a number of colleagues from health over here. So how do health practitioners and the health infrastructure come into the equation over here? How do we make sure that there's that dialogue between the two, not as an afterthought? At the school level, I'll make the point really quickly, making sure that all staff are involved in this conversation around inclusion. And again, in the Council for Disabled Children, we quite often talk about looking at across the board, from the people working in reception, the dinner ladies, to the whoever's involved with the daily running of the school, of course, support staff and the working and the workforce, the teacher workforce as well. And then lastly, on the individual level, making sure that this program of learning and development for teachers is in itself adaptable and flexible enough to meet the needs of different teachers. And again, really the idea over here would be to mirror the expectations we will have for the classroom, for the teaching workforce as well. And as I made a point in the session earlier, I'll make it again. For instance, I think some thought needs to be given to the question of, are we encouraging disabled people to enter the profession of teaching? It seems to me quite obvious that would hold some potential for increasing the kind of intimate and intrinsic understanding of what inclusion can and should be. So I'm just going to give you another moment to consider the slide while I take a sip, and then we will move on. Great. Thank you, Sam. Shall we move on? Right. I just want to reassure you that I am very keen to open the floor for some reflections and conversations with you. As I said, but just lesson from last time round, I'm going to try and go through at least most of the presentation first to make sure that we actually cover it. So I've spoken a bit about the approach ISNI has taken to considering questions around teacher professional development and training. And now I'm going to talk a bit about really what is quite a loaded question about what role do specialist provision play in the wider education and schooling system. This particular activity was called the Changing Role of Specialist Provision in Supporting Inclusive Education, or CROSP for short. And again, involved a number of member countries. And in the background, I would say that the agency by and large, was encouraging countries to consider how they might bring closer together the specialisms within the special school arena to bear on the mainstream state as well. And part of that was simply to clarify how might that look. Next slide, please. Great. This slide is simply for the purpose of providing you with a couple of links if you want to look directly at the project and its outputs. So do have a look. We will be sharing the slides after the event. Next slide, please. Right, so aside from those two outputs, the links to which we've just provided, and they're basically reports, there's also a really handy self-review tool, which is in the main intended for school leadership, but also for people who work on policy, and I would say especially at local government level. And this self-review tool, I don't know how well you can see the writing, but basically within it, settings and policymakers can kind of rank where they are in respect of different guiding questions. All these questions are looking at different aspects which were elicited from this cross project. What is important in setting up a new realigned role for the specialist provision in the wider education sector, excuse me. So think about things like the architecture around opportunities for exchange or practice between special schools, mainstream, and health, around communicating between schools, parent carers, and the wider community, around opportunities for professional development, etc., etc. It's very self-explanatory. The language is pretty generic to enable people from different countries to use it, but also to adapt it to their own needs. So I'm hoping that if you are in a leadership position, you might want to have a look at this. Again, it's free to access on the agency's website. Next slide, please, Sam. And some of the findings from this project. So, number one, the transformation of specialist provision towards inclusive education results in more learners being educated in mainstream settings, by which they mean in the cases where they've identified that actually local areas took this approach and they repurposed some of the special schools, for instance, to become part special school, part hub and outreach, they found that the net result was that more learners ended up being able to attend mainstream settings. It also led to a positive change in school level attitudes towards inclusion, and it increased schools' awareness to the need to develop inclusive and flexible learning environments. And really, it stands to reason that much of this is happening on the back of simply having a better understanding of a wider variety of need and having that opportunity for cross knowledge exchange between the different sectors. I'm just going to pause here for 1 second and make a kind of an unscripted comment. I was sitting on a panel not long ago with the head of NAS, which is the National Association for Special Schools, and she made what I think is a really important point. This shouldn't be seen as a one-direction travel of knowledge. Namely, this is not only about a specialist PMLD teacher supporting a mainstream classroom teacher and how best to work with this particular group. It's also the other way around. Many times special schools, for instance, do not have the same curricular expertise, or I should say curricular content expertise, which you will find in mainstream schools. And actually, as a result of that, quite often the curricula often in special schools might be more limited than is merited by the ability profile in the school. So, and similarly, mainstream school teachers, Sam and I were both the teachers in the past, and my wife is a current teacher. Mainstream school teachers, for better or worse, have to deal daily with different kinds of classroom management, for instance, that kind of low-level disruptive behavior. I'm using purposefully language that I wouldn't necessarily use myself, but what's conceived as low-level disruptive behavior. That's not something that necessarily comes to the fore too often in a special school content, but does bring with it a whole new level of understanding of the dynamics between pupils themselves and pupils and teachers. So there's a lot of knowledge and expertise to be drawn from both sides. So I just wanted to make that case that this is not about a one-way direction. And the second really important finding from this project was that in order to transform specialist provision into a resource, policymakers will have to attend to four main pillars of policy, namely governance, funding, capacity building, and quality assurance. And of course, we could speak at length about each of them. I just might indulge in one example. Funding is often on people's minds. It's, of course, at the face value, it sounds like a very good idea to make sure that we make available some of the specialism in special schools to mainstream schools. But how do you actually fund us? Is this a traded offer? Is it part of a wider policy in a local authority or even a national government, which is built in to provision? How do you pay for teachers' time? Do you need to attend to a new contracting of the special school staff, for instance, in order for them not to work only on one location, but to rove? Just a very small number of the kind of things the policymakers will need to war game if they are indeed to go in this direction. Next slide, please, Sam. And they came up with 6 guiding principles for a healthy, effective journey towards the rearticulation of the role of special schools. And I think, again, I'm going to just allow you a couple of minutes to read this instead of me reading it out to you. Okay, Sam, is there anything in the chat that they should be aware of, or?
Nope, stunned silence.
Stunned silence, okay. Not always necessarily a mark of good teaching and success, but we'll take it for now because I have managed to get through most of the presentation. So I am hoping that I can't see the vast majority either, so I can't even judge by facial expressions. I hope that you're finding this helpful and interesting so far. There's one more thing I would like to share with you, and then I think we might have a few minutes left for some conversation. On the back of this project CROSP, I was looking for an example of where this kind of approach was actually put into practice. And you might think this is a bit left field, and it usually does feel when you talk about quite randomly a different country, in this case, Lithuania. I think it's helpful to look at how this looks when it's actually put into action. I will talk at the end of this presentation on the two sides of making international comparisons, so acknowledging the difficulty, but actually also trying to make a case for why it might be helpful. Right, so let's go to the next slide. So in Lithuania, they opened what they called regional special education centers. What this was in practice was that in each of the regions, the 8 regions of the country is divided into 8 regions, sorry, 9. In each of these regions, they repurposed one special school out of the special school estate, and that special school basically became a center of excellence in effect for SEND, and you'll see in a moment what kind of functions it carried out. But again, this wasn't a dismantling of the whole special school estate. Rather, it was taking a regional approach to make sure they're beefing up the kind of SEND expertise across the region using existing resource within a particular special schools. Let's go to the next slide, please, Sam. Great, and these are the main goals. I'm just going to throw one interesting idea over here. This being divided into 3 kind of layers. I do find some interesting echoes to the AP kind of 3-tier approach, which was kind of set out in the SEND and Improvement Plan from March 23, if you remember that. And it'd be interesting to see what comes out of the white paper, of course, as well. In any event, the main goals and functions: to consult in various forms, to improve the competencies around inclusive pedagogy and practice, and to educate, or in other words, to have direct interventions with particular groups of pupils directly. Next slide, please, Sam. Right, so a bit more information on how this looks. And sorry, I should have said in advance, I'm not necessarily endorsing all of the language used over here. This is language, of course, they use in a different country. And these slides were translated for a particular session by a non-native English speaker. So I hope you can overlook if some of the language appears to you a bit outdated or inappropriate. I hope you can overlook that in favor of just getting a bit of a flavor of what happens in another country. Consult teachers around things of adaptation of educational contents, of adaptive teaching in effect, regarding selection of learning methods and teaching means, regarding selection of special teaching methodologies, and at the more kind of system, school and community level, for instance, the creation of an inclusive culture, formulation of related policies, and implementation of practices in the school. So the point they were trying to make in this particular slide, because I did interrogate the person after this session, was to differentiate between conversations the SEN experts were having with practitioners, teachers, and parents, to conversations that we're having at the more leadership level around things like policies, the general ambience and ethos, etc., etc. Next slide, please, Sam. Right. The algorithm of application is a slightly over-the-top way to explain on kind of basically the referral route. So I think interesting to see for those of you who kind of deal with pathways, etc. So the school, firstly, is supposed to the PPS over there, the psychological service in Lithuania. So first of all, get the kind of initial advice and support from them. Then the head of the school puts in a request if interventions are not successful or not yielding the right kind of outcomes, and then they are granted access to the regional special education center. Next slide, please. Right, this I think is an interesting one. So how does it actually look in practice? And this is how they are staffed. So they have a psychologist, a speech therapist, a special pedagogue, a social pedagogue. I do not have time to go into this question now, but elsewhere I have written about the fact that we, of course, don't have the same professional profiles that map over exactly to these, but hopefully you can get a flavor of it. And the child and adolescent psychiatrists, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, etc. And these are grouped together because, to the best of my understanding, the more kind of allied health professionals are put in place in relation to particular need profiles in the region, so it's not a standard. But this gives you, I hope, a flavor of how this center looks and how it's staffed. Next slide, please. Yeah, great, thanks, Dave. So, and again, this talks a bit about the way, I suppose, the mechanism itself works. So consultation by a mobile team, which can happen sort of a handful of times. Short-term consultations in situ in the resource provisions themselves can take up to 3 weeks. And then consultation, the medium-term consultations, and these are kind of direct interventions with children and young people. These might take up to 12 weeks. So you will see that this has been kind of quite well thought out, and the interventions are boundary to begin with in order to make sure that we don't basically get into a pattern of encouraging, I suppose, dependence, but rather there's direct interventions with children and young people, which is limited in time when needed, but more often than not, it will be a consultation with staff in order to give them the capacities to hold expertise longer term themselves. Next slide, please, Sam. And then I shared this because I thought it might be of interest. What are the main, over a period of, this was, I think, over a period of a quarter, what were the main issues brought to these SEND specialism centers? Possibly not surprising, at the top of this, emotional and behavioral disorders. Again, I'm not endorsing the language necessarily, but you can see what were the topics which came to these centers for advice and support. Just give you a few seconds to have a look at this and maybe map against your own experiences. Great, thanks, Sam. And next slide. Right, so as promised, It is not easy to compare between countries, and this is something that I try to do regularly, and we quite often come across some really significant differences. First of all, the size of a country does make a huge difference. I remember speaking to a representative from Malta, for instance, and they at some point pretty much scrapped the special school system. And I think he told me at the time they only had two special schools left. But then when he looked at the number they had to begin with and the number of pupils, it maybe seems less astounding. The degree to which funding and professional specialisms and governance and accountability is devolved, of course, has a huge impact on how the system will look, as does things which are more specific, for instance, about the system around labeling and distributing resources and funding systems, of course. So all of these are barriers, which means I cannot say to you, this is the one-to-one comparison, and we should simply lift up, for instance, the Lithuanian approach and bring it here. On the other hand, the benefits or the fringe benefits of these kind of comparisons, quite often, apart from the obvious, you can get interesting ideas which might be suitable for us as well, that it led me to think about the role of a specialist teacher as we talk about it in England, which is not the same as a special pedagogue on the continent. And again, we don't have time to go into it now, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this. But in England, when you talk about specialist teacher, it's usually vis-a-vis a particular type of impairment, so a specialist autism teacher or SPLD, or indeed simply a teacher who has experience of working in a special school. On the continent, it's something different, and they have a designated training route, and obviously that brings with it a different professional profile. So as I say, there are some fringe benefits of comparing apples with pears, as it were, anyway, because it does sometimes bring to the surface some unattended to questions. And then, of course, the last question is it empowering? Do you find it empowering to hear about an approach taken in a different country? Because simply it might give you, as a gift, an idea of maybe doing something differently in your local context. Next slide, please, Sam. Right, we don't really have time for me to go into what I was going to share some anecdotes from the latest biannual meeting of ISNI, which was in Bratislava. But I am writing a blog on this, and it will be on the CDC website, hopefully within a couple of weeks. So if you found this session today interesting or at least painless, please do have a look out for it. So I think we have one more slide, which is basically to ask for you to share some feedback. So please do so. And then Sam, maybe in a few seconds, could we stop sharing? I can bring everybody back. And I might even ask you guys to come onto your cameras, and I'm really interested to hear any thoughts, reflections, questions, etc. you might have before we close for the day.
I just popped in the chat around the reflections around education and what we need to get into professionals. But one of my things, I work in health, but my role is at Alder Hey as the clinical lead for SEND. So I get a really good opportunity to work across the system, but within the organisation. And one of the things I harp on about all the time is I really feel that education piece isn't just about getting into our school professionals. I think it's across the landscape of what a system looks like, and we should be educating people together. I know as a health professional, I was educated with other health professionals. We had elements where you were looking at those dynamics. But for me, I think we need to introduce social workers, teachers and health professionals before they even get into the big wide world, don't they? So I think it's really nice to kind of see those kind of themes around actually how we educate everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Point.
Thank you, Denny. And I have to say this exact same point came out quite forcefully in the previous session we did about an hour ago, because we also had good representation from health professionals over there. And it seems to me that increasingly people are talking about, for instance, I mean, I know this came up also this morning, the gap in accountability between health and education, the fact that health is not always at the table where really meaningful conversations are happening. I mean, one of the things I do quite often, for better or worse, is sit on different panels and round tables, and it's quite obvious to see at a very immediate level how the conversation looks differently when you have meaningful representation across the board from education, health, and social care. By the way, personally, I would say if you really want to solve the SELM crisis, as it's called, you also need to think about housing, employment, justice system. So yes, I couldn't agree more with your point, and thank you for making it. Any other thoughts, reflections, complaints? So I might just take the opportunity to apologize for the frantic pace. I did manage to get through the presentation, that's the upside, but possibly it might have been a bit much. But do have a look at the slides after the session. And I really would encourage you, in all honesty, to look at EASNY's website. It really is interesting, and they are doing the right thing. And it's difficult to speak to a whole continent, as it were, because of the differences I spoke about earlier, but they really are driving the kind of overarching message of inclusion and understanding it in that kind of wide sense, and really as a social mission. So I really would encourage you to do so. Any last minute contributions, thoughts? Okay, in that case, thank you so much for taking time and on what I'm sure is a busy day to listen, and I do hope you found it helpful. If anybody wants to reach out separately to talk about these matters, I'm always more than happy to engage in conversation, and I wish you a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.